All right, hey everybody. Welcome to lecture number 2 for History 1301, calling it A Brave New World. Hope you can see the map behind me. It's the same map you should be seeing on your slideshow as well. Just before we get into the lecture, once again, quick reminder, all this is happening online. There is no physical class right now because of the virus. Everything is labeled and posted on Blackboard. So all your assignments, there are some documentaries you need to watch. There's a PDF with each of those links, so print it and answer the questions and just hold on to those. Those are on the test. Of course, do your key terms. Those are on the test. You want to turn those in for extra credit? That would be great. Why not? And of course, the Voices of Freedom is a homework assignment, and you should have one of those due coming up pretty quick. But let's get to this lecture. This is going to talk about a few things, Protestant Reformation, a couple other things that happen in this period around 1500. And so what I want us to do is kind of think about this year of 1500. I call it the year that changed everything. Now, this is not exact. We already talked about Columbus. That happened initially in 1492. And so I count that on this list, all right? When he discovered the New World, that changed everything. But there's a number of other things that are happening in the 15th century and around this time of 1500 that impact everything. So you see the printing press here in the background. That's a Gutenberg printing press. Where he's this European guy who developed this way to not just print stuff, but it's a movable type printing press, which means it's easy to reset. Easy by their standards, a huge pain by ours. But it was easy to reset, so they could quickly produce new works. And so this is going to give rise to books and newspapers and pamphlets and some of these other things we're going to talk about. And, just think about something for a minute. You didn't probably have to buy a book for this class, but let's say you did. Or if you buy any books now, you can go to Barnes & Noble or your favorite bookstore and buy a paper copy of a book for $1, $2, $5. This textbook, brand new at the store, is like $75. And that's a little bit of money, but that's not a huge burden. Most people can afford that. That's at worst an entire day's labor, if you're getting paid minimum wage or something like that. But imagine buying a book for what it would cost to have a handful of experts, scribes, or copyists making this book. So by hand, they would have to be copying this book. They would have to be drawing all the pictures in it. That's why old books don't have pictures. They're works of art, the ones that do. And, it would take a team of men, let's say 6 men, 6 months to create this book. One copy. That copy is going to be super valuable. Supply and demand is going to make it valuable. The labor that goes into making the book makes it valuable. So you can go buy a book at Barnes & Noble for $5. That book might cost $50,000, relatively speaking, to pay for all of those people and all of their time. And that means no one can afford books. But once the printing press comes along, then quickly everyone can afford books. Again, everyone's reading newspapers, everyone's reading pamphlets. The reading level in especially Western Europe goes way up and becomes pretty universal pretty quickly. And this is a way that information is transferred. That's the idea of the printing press. It's kind of like the internet of its age. And there's some of you out there, maybe, that can remember life before the internet and how different things were and what the internet did. And it sped up our ability to get information. So here, it's going to do that as well. The ability for the government to put out information. Yes, unfortunately, the ability for the government to lie to us. So there's propaganda. But the ability for scientists to get their information out, for artists, writers, these things become very, very popular. Shakespeare, for example, and others, poets and others, are going to become much more popular, much more accessible as a result of the printing press. So you can see on here, I have several things listed. So like art and science. I think in terms of science. If you have a science guy in Italy and a science guy in England and a science guy in France, they're not going to be able to talk to each other that much unless they actually know each other. And a lot of these countries tried to have like a Royal College of Science or something, and that helped if people could meet in person. And again, they might copy down some of the notes or ideas, but they're certainly not sharing too much with other countries. This allows people to cross-pollinate. So if English science guy and Italian science guy have an idea and they pursue that as far as they can, if they could combine their ideas, it could be a meshing, a synchronizing or synergy of their ideas, and they'll come up with better ideas. That's one of the major importances of moving information around. Another thing would be navigation. People are starting to navigate. They're starting to write down and make maps and charts of the things that they're experiencing. And so the more that happens, the more different people are seeing these maps and charts, the more that people are realizing that there are currents in the ocean and currents in the wind, and there are certain things that regularly happen. We'll actually talk more about that phenomenon later in this lecture. The population is exploding at this point. So there was a black plague, actually several times where that's happened, but one time in particular, it killed, some estimates say, as much as 50% of the entire population of Europe within about a year. I mean, so much so that they didn't have a place to put them all. They couldn't deal with the number of deaths, and maybe something to think about these days. So what that did is it depleted the population to a significant degree. It depleted the working population. I mean, it struck everyone equally, but it depleted the working population. The working population became more valuable. That's part of the reason why feudalism goes away, where you have knights and castles and they kind of run everything and everyone else is a peasant or a serf that works for them. The plague actually begins the process of changing that. But 200 or 300 years later, if you remember from lecture 1, talked about the bunny rabbit principle, that if you have a boy and a girl bunny rabbit, you're going to get a lot of bunny rabbits. Well, people are the same. Again, given plenty of resources, and when half the population dies, there are plenty of resources. Better technology and things are coming along too, so that we're producing more food. So in any case, around 1500, the population in Europe is bursting at the seams. I put gunpowder on here because at this time period, it is becoming weaponized and useful. So there's a number of applications. We're going to start getting into an era of industry. We'll talk about that sometime later in the class. More importantly, right now, think about its primary function, which was weapons. So that knight, feudalism is all based on having a knight, a large man on a large horse wearing a suit of armor with a large weapon. And basically, unless you're similarly armed, you can't stand up to that guy. And so that's why those guys were in charge. Now, if you have a gun, you can just shoot that guy, and he's now a target. And so we're going to start to see at this point, because of gunpowder, again, industry, but also nations are starting to change. And the idea of a government like we're more used to comes into being, these nation states rather than these sort of feudal domains and so on. We'll still have kings and monarchies in many places, but that's another issue we'll get to later. And of course, a lot of changes in religion and politics. That's one of the points of this particular lecture. We will talk about the Protestant Reformation, but it is not and should not be a surprise to you that the Protestant Reformation happens right after, not long after, the printing press is developed. These people, these reformers, rely on getting their information out to the public. And some of these men were particularly good at using pamphlets and things to get it out. And also, of course, there's going to one of the first things that comes off the printing press is going to be Bibles. And so we'll start having Bibles translated into native languages, vernacular languages, and copies of them then being printed and sold. And pretty much since then, the Bible's been the #1 selling book in the world. So this will have a huge impact on religion and politics and so on. So let's start thinking about the Protestant Reformation. I have a picture here of Martin Luther, who's the most famous reformer. There are many, many other reformers. Some come before him, many come after. And here he is nailing his 95 Theses to the door. And we'll get to that in a minute. But I want you to see here, though, as you look at this term, Protestant Reformation, I want you to notice that you see the words protest and reform. And that's what Luther's doing. That's what many of these early reformers in particular are doing. They're trying to reform the church. At the time, the Catholic Church is big. Last lecture, we talked about the Treaty of Tordesillas, how powerful the Pope was and where he could draw that line on the map, and that's what became the truth. And so Portugal and Spain then basically have carte blanche to do whatever they want in the world. But that's how powerful the church is in everyone's life, from the king all the way down. Now, these guys and ladies are trying to reform that. They're protesting things that they believe the church is doing wrong, and they want the church to fix itself, to be reformed. Now, often the answer is no, and these people will then become heretics. The ones that survive might accidentally end up starting new religious groups. Martin Luther's intent was never to start a new religious movement. His intent, and many of these people's intent, was the same: to, again, reform the church, to have it changed to be in line with what they believed the Bible actually taught. So let's think about this. And one of the main results of all of this is the challenge of authority. And I'll explain that as we look at this slide. So we have Martin Luther's 95 Theses. He's hammering it on the church door. That sounds real weird to us, but that's what they did in those days. When they wanted to talk about something, the church building was kind of the central location in the town usually, and people tended to assemble there. And so they would hammer something to the door, and that would be the next thing that was going to get discussed, kind of like a town hall meeting, or you posting something on Facebook because you want people to talk about it. It's basically the 1517 version of that. So he had 95 issues that he was concerned about. We're not going to go into those. That would be subject to another class, a different class. But one of them just kind of stands out, and that's the idea of indulgences. What the Catholic Church at the time was doing was selling sin, basically, and that you could donate money and you would get a document from the Pope that would basically forgive you of sin or lessen your time in purgatory. There's different versions of it. And so the idea that you could pay in advance for these things. And some of you are thinking, wow, that doesn't work that way. Bible doesn't teach that. And that's exactly the conclusion Martin Luther came to. He said that's wrong. Again, among many other things. Luther himself was a Catholic priest, very devout, so devout that he beat himself, and people kind of feared for his life and his sanity in some cases. But later on, he started teaching and doing things differently, and he came to some very different conclusions, 95 of them at least at this point. So, because as he does that, he challenges the church on this issue of indulgences and many others. The church refuses to budge, excommunicates him. He manages to not get executed. Some were, some weren't. And accidentally, because he continues to preach and teach what he believed, a new church is started, the Lutheran Church in Germany, Switzerland, that area. And that's why this all begins there. But he's not the only one. There are many, many, many other reformers. Some, again, have come before Luther. He's just the most famous. Many come after, and of course then the reformers start to reform each other, and so we end up with all kinds of different Christian religious denominations. Again, subject for another class. But this also leads to a bunch of political reforms. And again, this goes back to the idea of challenging authority. So just think about what's going on. As I said earlier, the Pope is extremely powerful. The Pope can dictate what a king or queen does, what policies they can enact, what wars they can fight in, different things like that, and on. And then, of course, those governments are paying, if you want to call them taxes, but they're paying the church for services and different things. And so this him challenging the church, the ultimate authority, is going to then cause political change. Germany, for example, where Luther's from, number one, Germany is not a single nation like this until the 1800s. It's a whole series of little tiny kingdoms. And so each one's autonomous, but they tend to follow one another. But this will divide those little kingdoms. Some will be Catholic, some will be Protestant, right? Some will be, and they'll go to war with each other. And so that very, very quickly, this kind of thing escalates into a great deal of violence. What some of those German kingdoms will do is follow Lutherans' pattern. They will decide to remove the Catholic Church. Of course, what that does is it removes the authority of the Pope from them. What prince or king or lord wouldn't want that? And so that's kind of the impact that it has, as people are, and I'm saying this from their view, would throw off the yoke of the church so that they can have more power or more independence, as the case may be. France kind of does it differently. France will remain Catholic by and large. Again, they will have their own Protestant reforms, and of course Protestantism grows in every country. But the monarchy will remain Catholic, and the government officially will remain Catholic. But what the king will do is sort of insert himself. If this is the Pope, the king will insert himself in the hierarchy, whereas the Pope and the council would determine who the bishops and church leaders are. Now the king's going to do that. So effectively, the king can put his people as bishops and so on in the head of these church. And then you get to England, and I have a picture here of Henry VIII, and most people are familiar with Henry VIII in terms of how he'd behead his wives and everything. And that's true. What's going on here with England, remember England's an island, so islands always have a little bit more independence anyway. But here's Henry VIII, who is the sort of beneficiary of this long kind of civil war that Shakespeare refers to as the War of the Roses. And Henry's not getting sons. He needs sons to put on the throne. And of course, Henry, you can see him here, he blames his wife. And he decides that, well, if I had a new wife, I could probably get some sons. So he asks the Pope to grant him some kind of divorce. And the Pope says, no, we don't do that. And in the end, what Henry ends up doing is separating completely from the Catholic Church and creating a new church. It is called the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. And at first, it's basically a carbon copy of the Catholic Church, except it's a whole separate entity. And the head of the church is the king. So in Henry's case, he now becomes the King of England, or he was the King of England. So he's politically powerful. Now he's the head of the church, so he's religiously powerful, and he has granted himself independence from the Catholic Church. And there's not a lot the church can do about it at this point. He does end up divorcing his queen, and he goes through a whole bunch of wives. Ironically, he never really gets a son who's going to last. He has some sons, and one of them actually sits on the throne very briefly. But the irony is, one of his daughters, Elizabeth, who we'll talk about in another lecture, is going to be one of the greatest monarchs in British history. So it's just kind of funny how things work out. But don't think that he's using the divorce as an excuse. It may be as the sole reason. It may be the sort of straw that broke the camel's back on why he decided to separate. But they are going to separate. They will create their own church. It'll be called the Church of England, and they'll be quite successful. As the British Empire grows, so will the church. So bottom line here, though, is they're challenging authority. You're challenging the churches, the Catholic Church's authority. The leaders are challenging the Catholic Church's authority. Eventually, this is going to spill over into other people challenging authority, and the kings then won't like that too much. Now, let's turn our attention to another issue, which is called the Age of Reason, the Age of Enlightenment, the Renaissance. Those are all technically different terms, and they have technically different meanings. But for our purposes, we'll kind of lump them all together and think about them in an era where people are beginning to think differently. And I have on here Galileo, a picture of Galileo, and a quote from Galileo. "I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with senses, reason, and intellect has intended us to forego their use." Now, Galileo's a Christian, as almost all of these guys were. You got to remember, all these scientists were also very religious for the most part. Galileo is famous for inventing kind of a telescope and looking out into the stars, and he realizes that, hey, the universe seems to operate in a way differently than what we've been taught. And so he challenges some common views on that. And he gets into sort of a personal match with one of the popes. This wasn't as much a religious issue as it was a personal issue. But in any case, he gets excommunicated for a while. He has to recant his ideas. But the reality is what he witnessed or viewed through his telescope was truth. And so we're getting to this period of time, again, Age of Reason, Age of Enlightenment, Renaissance, the idea of science, which is not a new idea, but it makes a lot of headway come back here during this period of time. And it's the use of reason and intellect, as we read Galileo saying, and observing things and making intelligent decisions about what we've observed. And let me give you a great example of that. I don't know how many of you like to scuba dive. I do. I love it. This is a picture of, well, a bunch of us, but a buddy and me. We're in the Bahamas. Man, it's been about 10 years now. And we were scuba diving, and we did this one dive where they fed all these sharks. You can see there's like, I don't know, 30 sharks kind of bunching around us. We're not in cages or anything. It was a rush. It was totally awesome. But I bring this up because Galileo had an assistant named Torricelli, who I think was sort of annoying to Galileo, and of course didn't always agree with Galileo. Remember, these guys are all scientists. They're all doing their own thing. And basically, sort of the long story short, Galileo tells Torricelli, get out of here and go weigh air or something. And Torricelli actually figures out how to do it. And the reason I bring that up with scuba diving is because his work, for example, allows me to go scuba diving because the weight of air matters, or the weight of the atmosphere rather matters. The weight of water matters on how deep I can go, how long I can stay under. There are parameters that I have to operate under if I go scuba diving because I'm in an environment that's unnatural and I have to obey the rules. And so Torricelli figured out how much a column of air weighed. And of course, it turns out that a column of water 33 feet deep weighs the same. And that's how scuba divers know how much air they're using. And we have computers now that do most of that in real time. But it's great. And so Torricelli, Galileo, talk about Newton here. By the way, did you know that Newton invented the fig Newton? Okay. He actually didn't. I'm lying to you. I'm just kidding. Newton's another scientist, though, comes a little bit after Galileo, and kind of comes up, in part at least, with these ideas of something we're going to call natural law. And these are all, you might be wondering, why are we talking about science and whatever? Well, that's the beauty of history. Everything has a history, and science has a history, and religion has a history, and politics have a history, and the internet has a history. You have a history. But all of these things matter, and we'll kind of tie them all together as we go through some of these lectures. But here's Newton sitting under I guess that's an apple tree. Could have been a fig tree. I mean, who knows? I think this is fiction. This is not really real. There was no apple. But what Newton does, and kind of for the first time, is envision gravity as a law, as a natural law, as a rule. Something that always happens. In other words, if you have an apple in your hand, or a glass, or anything, and you let it go, it's going to hit the floor. Right? It's going to fall down. Always. And there's nothing really that's going to change that. So he envisions gravity as a rule, as a law. And of course, he wrote a lot of books and came up with a whole bunch of other things. We have a whole group of physics called Newtonian physics. It's the stuff you would learn in high school generally if you're taking a physics class. It's force times mass and acceleration and all that stuff. It's how the world works. He observed it and he did the math on it, and he put all the formulas out there. So when you're when you're doing those math problems about time and distance and everything, that's basically Newtonian stuff there. And what he does is he kind of envisions the world as a machine, all right? And so that gives rise to new worldviews. And I want to talk about basically, and these are very general terms. So if you take Western civilization, we might talk more about these things. You'll certainly read more about these things in your textbook. But what I have here is the contrast between the two worldviews, and of course they're happening in common. But the old view, the previous view that's lasted for a long time, mostly, this is not absolute, but mostly, is that God is like a puppeteer. So you can see he's holding the little rack with the strings, and the strings go into the world, and so everything and anything that happens in the universe, of course specifically on the earth, but in the universe, is because God's pulling a string, right? So if there's a lightning strike, it's because God made it happen. If there's an earthquake, if you fall down, all those kind of things. And so God affects the world sort of in real time, right? And that's how most people would have thought. This view that Newton sort of, in part, Newton brings up is this idea that the world or the universe is a machine, right? And the machine acts and obeys on certain laws. I mean, think about it. You have a car. Any machine operates this way. It has a bunch of rules. You don't have to even know all the rules. You just know there are rules there. So you all probably have a car. And you know that when you put the key in and turn it, or when you push that button, if you have one of those fancy cars, that it should start. You don't need to know the process that takes. Some of you might, but most of you probably don't. And you know that if you push on the skinny pedal on the right side, it'll go faster. And if you push on the big pedal or the middle pedal, if you have a manual, does anybody still drive manuals? We all do. But if you have that and you push on that pedal, you know it's supposed to stop. So you know those are the basic rules. You know if it doesn't start, it's either out of gas or your battery's dead, probably, right? You know something's broken. The rules are broken, and so it's not working. So this is the same idea. The world operates on these rules. Newton saw gravity as one of those rules. He doesn't know how that rule works. He doesn't know how to manipulate the rule, but he knows it's there. So, if there are all these rules, then we as human beings, using our reason and intellect, can learn to manipulate and use those rules. God still exists. He's just not a puppeteer. He's just observing it. They're not even suggesting necessarily that God can't intervene. Some will, but not all. But it's a very different view of the world and how things work. And we'll see how that comes into play later. But more and more people start looking at the world this way. This does not imply that they become less religious. It just means they view how God operates differently. But in saying there are natural laws, that opens a whole new way of looking at the world. That is, we can manipulate these natural laws in order to do things. So electricity is a great example. We know how to manipulate the laws to use it effectively. We know it's very dangerous, but we also don't fear it shooting out of the wall in our house or the classroom or wherever we are. We don't fear our phones exploding, but we use the electricity. We don't know all the rules, but we know enough of them to use it successfully. There's engineers and other people that know all the rules, and they create this technology for us. But hydraulics, there's so many applications here. That's really what Newtonian physics is. So this is going to change how people look at the world, but it's also going to change how people look at people. If there are natural laws that govern the universe, are there natural rights too? Are there natural laws that govern humanity? And then are there rights that go with that? And so that's an issue we'll explore at another time. So a lot going on here. And man, my time's pretty much up. So the next lecture, which is about perfect, the next lecture is going to be called Britain Rising. We're going to go into talking about England and the British Empire and the colonization of America. And we're going to sort of narrow our focus down to the British. We'll bring in other groups as they interact with the British Empire, but that's where we're heading next. So appreciate your attention, and I will see you next time.